In what would be the biggest mafia trial to date, Giuseppe Morello, Ignazio Lupo, Antonio Scala, Salvatore Sina, the master printer Calicchio, and the two brothers, Luca and Pasquale, arrived in court on January 26, 1910. The trial would be held in New York City at the federal courthouse on Houston Street. The Honorable Judge George Ray would preside. By order of Nick Terranova, Morello's soldiers turned out en masse to support their boss. The benches of the courtroom were soon packed with angry Sicilians. Soon the building was standing room only. Many that could not find space were forced to wait outside. After more than an hour of standing by, the defendants finally entered the courtroom. Giuseppe Morello swaggered in, despite the steel cuffs attached to his wrists. In his heart, he felt assured of an acquittal. There was plenty of evidence, he knew, against several of his men. Antonio Scala had been caught with Flynn's-marked bills, while the Vassi brothers were the ones found with the majority of the seized counterfeits. The first day of trial went without incident. Opening statements were read, and there were several hisses and threatening hand gestures from the crowd. Things began to take a turn the second day when the bailiff found a stiletto driven into the wall of the room where the jury deliberated. Luckily, it was removed before the jury saw it. It was clear Morello planned to be proactive in his defense. After the jury and defendants took their seat, the prosecution called their first witness. Comito walked into the courtroom, looking from the floor to his seat on the witness stand, and then back to the floor. He tottered over and was finally able to mount the steps and take his seat. At that moment, he turned and looked out into the courtroom. Morello, now flushed with rage, started to rise from his chair before his lawyer grabbed his arm. "Rat!" Giuseppe Morello growled in Sicilian. In response to this, Judge Ray banged his gavel. "Silence!" the judge yelled. "I'll see you in chains, Mr. Morello, if you so much as move a muscle." As the judge finished, his eyes scanned the room as if looking for a challenge. The defendant, as well as the gallery, sat and quieted. While it would be wrong to say that the Morello gang was not intimidating, it would be wrong to say that Judge Ray was intimidated. Morello knew his authority was invalid here. The prosecution went through the entire ordeal, step by step, including Comito's meetings with Lupo and Morello. Towns did his best in cross-examination to portray Comito as a violent criminal who made his money in the white slave trade. However, this did little to soften the blow. By the time Comito had finished testifying, every defendant was hanging their head, including Giuseppe Morello. By the time court wrapped up for the day, the Terranova brothers had already put a $2,500 open-ended contract on the life of Comito. The next day, Morello attorney Mirabeau Towns called several alibi witnesses. They gave their testimony calmly and competently. Still, dates and times read from police and Secret Service surveillance reports seemed to hold more weight with the jury than the statements of two Italian doctors. As such, they were each torn apart on cross-examination. Another rough day for the defense. Morello and Lupo both felt shaky about their chances after listening to Comito's testimony. By morning of the next day, both the prosecution and the defense had finished their closing arguments, and the jury retired to deliberate. The defendants felt that the longer the jury was out, the better their chances of acquittal. However, when the jury returned after only 45 minutes of deliberation, Morello began to look understandably nervous. Prior to the arrival of the jury, Judge Ray had cleared the courtroom of all spectators so as to avoid any scene as the verdict was read. All that remained were the court officers, the defendant, and the jury. Morello shifted nervously, and Lupo sat stone-faced while the verdicts were read. "For Giuseppe Morello, on the counts listed above, how do you find the defendant?" Judge Ray shouted at the top of his lungs. "Guilty," the jury foreman shouted back. "For Ignazio Lupo, on the counts listed above, how do you find the defendant?" Ray shouted again. "Guilty," the jury foreman yelled back. One by one, the guilty verdicts cascaded down. Scala, guilty. Calicchio, guilty. Sina, guilty. Luca and Pasquale Valli, guilty. Every guilty verdict felt like a nail in the coffin of New York's most powerful crime family. With that finished, the judge began handing down their sentences. Colicchio was the first to be called before the judge. The master printer began sobbing when the court reporter translated his sentence of 17 years. Morello was called next. He needed no translation to understand his sentence. 25 years of hard labor. The most powerful mob boss in New York collapsed to the floor in shame. Then, with the help of the bailiff, he rose and was escorted from the courtroom. Lupo was next to be called up. The mask of the wolf was gone. What stood before the judge was a blubbering and scared man who begged for mercy while soaking his handkerchief with tears. The judge showed him no mercy and gave him 30 years hard labor. Lupo walked with the officer in an almost catatonic state out of the courtroom. The rest of the defendants received similar sentences. As word reached the crowd outside, groans and sobbing could be heard loud and often. Several family members of the mafiosos cursed and yelled at the officers. Because Flynn feared retaliation from Morello's soldiers, the Secret Service chief advised his agents to avoid cameras. This was partly for their safety, but it was also because Flynn wanted the spotlight for himself. With his ego firmly in control, he stayed behind on the courthouse steps and answered several questions. Weeks later, a second trial led to the incarceration of Giuseppe Boscarini and his entire crew, dealing yet another blow to the crime family. Comito got wind of the contract on his life, and with Flynn's help, he arranged for passage to South America before it could be carried out. Comito would die in his bed, an old man. Others would not be so lucky. Sam Locino, the man who had made the introduction to Boscarini, was shot twice in the head leaving his house early one morning. The bullet only grazed his skull, leaving him alive but shaken. He left town shortly after. Another suspected informant, Luigi Bono, was shot dead and dumped in an East Harlem alleyway. It seems treachery would not be tolerated. Giuseppe Morello, now in jail and awaiting his transfer to a federal prison in Atlanta, faced a serious problem. Who had the respect, intelligence, and loyalty to lead the Borgata while he was away? His younger brother Nick Terranova was Morello's first choice. He was both tough and smart. He was also blood, and blood meant loyalty. Still, holding together the Morello empire was not a simple task. The boss needed to command respect, not just in East Harlem, but all across New York. Nicola was only 22 years old, and Morello thought that was too young to command the respect of a boss. With this in mind, he made the decision from prison that two Corleonesi mafiosos named Tommaso and Fortunato Lamonte would lead the family in Morello and Lupo's absence. Morello's brother-in-law was close with the Lamontes, and the clutch hand felt that they could be trusted. Niccolo accepted his demotion to capo with grace as the fractured family attempted to put the pieces back together. Meanwhile, Agent Flynn continued to be a thorn in the side of the mafia. He began developing an informant by the name of Salvatore Clemente, who looked to be very well positioned within the family. A short but handsome and gregarious man, Clemente had been to prison twice for counterfeiting. From the start, he became an ideal informant in almost every respect. He had a record a mile long, more than sufficient to establish his criminal credentials. He was also Sicilian, born in 1866, and acquainted with practically every counterfeiter in New York. He was also a close friend of the Terranova brothers. To sweeten the pot, he had absolutely no wish to return to jail. As a two-time loser, Clemente was done with prison life, so when the Secret Service picked him up again during the autumn of 1910, he was only too willing to make a deal to avoid prison time. Over time, he would become Flynn's primary source of information. All totaled, there were almost 24 made men convicted in the two counterfeiting trials. Because of this, the Fortunatos and the Terranovas set about replenishing their ranks. Being made into the family were tough guys like Eugene Ubrazio and Giuseppe Verenzano, as well as earners like Joe DeMarco and his brother Sal, who ran several gaming houses and card games in Little Italy. This would be the first time men from outside the Corleonesi would be made into the family. The last man to take the oath wasn't even quite old enough to be considered a man. Still, the 17-year-old before them had a bearing of someone much older. Like the rest, Calogero Morello had made his bones and now entered his father's secret society as a made man. As Morello spent more time behind bars, his health truly began to decline. He had lost a large amount of weight, and depression had begun to set in. Also, moving the Lamonte brothers into power had started looking like a mistake. Their rapid fall from grace began with the death of Pasquarella Spinelli. Spinelli was a stout, tough, 60-year-old woman who was the owner of the largest livery stable for miles around. She leased several tenements to poor Italian families and owned the largest Italian vaudeville theater in Manhattan. She also happened to be one of the city's biggest loan sharks. As her business was conducted in Little Italy, she fell under and paid protection to the Lamonte brothers and by proxy, the Morello crime family. So when Spinelli was found dead, shot through the head and neck by assassins, it should have fallen to the Lamonte brothers to avenge her. However, no inquiries were ever made and nothing was ever done. Losing respect is dangerous for a racketeer. It starts little by little. Then, small holes in the fabric of a gangster's reputation turn into giant tears within the blink of an eye. And so the Lamonte brothers sat on their hands, much to the consternation of Nick Terranova and his brothers. That afternoon, the Terranovas sat in the corner of their saloon on Prince Street, while Nick railed against the Lamontes. "Can you believe these buffoons?" Niccolo Terranova scoffed. "That crone Spinelli gets killed and they do nothing," he continued, now beginning to rant. The other two brothers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This is the way Giuseppe wanted it, brother," Ciro Terranova cautioned. "But Giuseppe doesn't know about this," the older brother Vincenzo interjected before Nick chimed in again. "Our brother is not well. Let's keep this from him for now until we have a solid course of action." Thinking of the health of Morello, the other two brothers agreed to keep quiet. When word got out that Spinelli was not going to be avenged, the Morello family's reputation began to suffer. The Bronx and Brooklyn capos began to slowly move away from the family's power base in Little Italy and East Harlem. When you are seen as weak, you become a target, and to the underworld at large, the Morello family was looking weaker and weaker. There are points in time that define who a person is in their heart and soul. These watershed moments change not only the trajectory of a person's life, but often change the person down to the core. The death of young Calogero Morello would be that moment for Nick Terranova. On a clear spring evening, a few blocks from Morello's saloon, Calogero Morello took an evening stroll down 3rd Avenue with his best friend Joe Palazzo. "Could you believe her, Joe? What a knockout!" Calogero bantered as he and his friend walked back from the pool hall. "She was making eyes at me, Gaffon." Joe laughed as the two young men enjoyed the night air. Calogero had been called to meet with a gang member from the Upper East Side. When the man never showed, Calogero and his friend stuck around for a while and chatted up some young ladies at the bar before walking home. An older, more experienced man might have seen the ruse for what it was. Another mafioso, his father perhaps, might have heard an alarm going off in his head, or maybe felt the hair standing up on the back of his neck. But Calogero felt none of this. He had forgotten the darker parts of his father's life, and unfortunately, the truth of that life was about to be brought home in the most terrible way. As they rounded the corner, 4 men with guns drew down on the pair and fired. The inexperienced assassins missed with most of their shots. However, Morello was staggered by a wound to the stomach. Palazzo also took a bullet to the lung. Seriously wounded, Calogero and Joe drew their own weapons and returned fire, mortally wounding one of their attackers. To their credit, the 2 young mafiosos fought well. An ambulance arrived taking both victims and their wounded assailant to the hospital. None of the 3 said a word while they remained conscious. At the hospital, a priest administered the last rites. Calogero Morello died just months before his 18th birthday. Flynn caught news of the shooting the next morning. Word on the street was that Caligiero's attacker had been sent by Barlow the Kid Baker, a gang leader from the Upper East Side. As far as motive for the murder, though, Flynn was at a loss. Baker had no ties to the Morello family or the Mafia as a whole, so there was much speculation around East Harlem about what could have precipitated the attack. Other wild theories suggested that Calogero was suspected of informing and was killed by his own family, or that he was killed due to the gang's involvement in the prostitution racket. However, there was nothing concrete that Flynn could hang his hat on. In order to get to the bottom of this ordeal, Flynn called in top informant and Morello family associate Salvatore Clemente. As close friends of the Terranova brothers, he would have his hand on the pulse of the family. The two met in the Bronx to avoid prying eyes and walls with ears. Flynn arrived and headed to a rear booth towards the back of the saloon. There Clemente sat, sipping whiskey, while casually chatting up the waitress. This guy just can't help himself, Flynn thought with annoyance. Scram, kid, Flynn snapped at the waitress as he sat across from Clemente. Oh, come on, Agent Flynn. I was just about to ask her out, Clemente whined as he motioned to the retreating waitress to come back to the table. Do yourself a favor, Sal. Don't try it, Flynn snapped again, this time directing his rage toward Clemente. Now I have an idea of who was involved, but the piece I'm missing is why. And you're gonna give it to me, Sal, Flynn lectured as Clemente shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Flynn had toughened up since his first meeting with Joe Petrosino all those years ago, and he was channeling his old colleague's energy now. Clemente saw his anger and immediately changed his tone. Hey, paisan, no need to get bent out of shape about it, Clemente said, now sufficiently cowed. I heard that the Baker gang was responsible for the Morello boy's death. Is that true? Flynn questioned as his eyes burned with rage. Whoa, Agent Flynn, take it easy, Clemente chided. Things aren't exactly the way they seem. This was a planned ambush. Kid Baker didn't give the order. The boy got lured to 3rd Avenue by one of Baker's lieutenants, who just happened to be Benedetto Madonia's nephew, Clemente said, letting the last sentence hang in the air. This unsettled Flynn deeply. I can't remember the guy's name, but it's a vendetta, not a gang takeover, Clemente added. To Flynn, it didn't matter if it was a gang takeover or a vendetta over Madonia. Blood would be spilled for this, either way. The news hit the Terranova family very hard. Ciro worried constantly, which he was prone to do, while Niccolo and Vincenzo alternated between stages of rage and grief. The three brothers were at a loss for what to do. The boy's father, Giuseppe Morello, was already in poor health. To bring him news of his son's death while already languishing in prison, they feared would be the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. They were afraid it would kill him. It wasn't long before word would reach Morello anyway. Heartbroken and stuck behind bars, Morello became a shell of himself. Shortly after Caligero's murder, the Terranova brothers arrived at Lamonte's saloon. They walked in and sat as Tommaso Lamonte poured them all drinks. Word is out that it was that bastard Kid Baker and his gang who ambushed Calogero, Ciro Terranova said as the men sat around the table. Hey, let's slow down, Tommaso said, gesticulating. We need to make sure we do not overreact. Kid Baker's gang is full of thugs and cutthroats. We should be careful to protect everything we built, he finished. You mean everything our brother built, Vincenzo growled. Even more reason to protect it, Fortunato countered. As he listened, Nick Terranova began to flush with anger. He had no use for these cowards. A vein pulsed in the young man's forehead, and for a moment it looked as if he would strike Tommaso. Instead, he turned and wordlessly walked out. It seemed the meeting was over. Due to the Lamonte brothers' mismanagement, capos once under the Morello umbrella began to slowly inch away. Salvatore D'Aquila in Brooklyn was now operating independently of the family. Gaetano Reina in the Bronx also. This once great empire had finally been fractured. A few days later, young Calogero Morello was laid to rest. The Morello family continued to lose respect every day the assassins lived. In the middle of the service, Niccolo Nick Terranova surprised everyone when he rose from his chair. As if in a trance, he walked to where the casket lay and placed his hand on it. Rather than continue to abide by the cowardice of the Lamonte brothers, Nick Terranova was going to take a stand. As if flipping a switch, the ice broke, and unfiltered rage began to flow from within the man. To the scum who call that rat Barlow the Kid their leader, know that I, Nick Terranova, will not rest until each of the cowards involved in my nephew's death are hunted down and made to beg for their life, he continued, roaring loudly as if attempting to speak to God himself. I will butcher them one by one, and their families will weep bitter tears as we weep today, he finished, staring at each member of the congregation as he spoke. But there were no tears in Nick Terranova's eyes, just a wild rage that looked like it took every ounce of concentration to control. Shortly after the funeral, Nick Terranova immediately began plotting the murders of all those involved in the death of Calogero Morello. The first on his list was a well-known lieutenant of Baker himself. Less than a week later, Niccolo Terranova tracked down the man leaving a relative's home. Terranova's mind was a curious mixture of burning rage and ice-cold determination. Terranova lay in wait until the man finally emerged from the tenement. He then jumped from the shadows and shot the man dead just feet from the building's door. A few weeks later, Terranova would also kill the man who had lured his nephew Calogero to his death. In poetic fashion, the man was himself lured to an apartment by a lovely young woman whom he had picked up at the saloon that very evening. When the couple arrived to consummate the affair, the betrayer found out they were a trio. Neither body was ever found. When Clemente ran into the brothers later that week at the saloon, he found them discussing their alibis quietly. This led him to believe that they were indeed involved in these slayings. After several days of checking the newspaper and watching their back, the Terranova men began to relax. With his nephew Calogero's murder avenged, Nick Terranova began receiving a new level of respect. In the underworld, respect equals power, and Nick Terranova's respect was growing exponentially. From his new base of operations on 116th Street, Nick Terranova was becoming a wealthy man. He had built a profitable horse theft racket and cargo hijacking racket, among many others. He also inherited his brother's loan sharking and extortion rackets, making him one of the most powerful men in Little Italy. Meanwhile, the strength of the Lamontes had begun to recede. Their inability to avenge the deaths of Spinelli, Calogero, and others was a major breach in Mafia protocol. While Nick Terranova was on his way up, the Lamonte brothers were headed in the opposite direction. The only man who could still eclipse Nick Terranova's shining star in this ethnic enclave was a powerful Neapolitan man who had once irritated Ignazio Lupo with his public profile. He went by the name of Giosuè Gallucci. Giosuè Gallucci was a popular man for a gangster, and some even referred to him as the King of Little Italy. This was a name which he publicly eschewed, but privately enjoyed. Gallucci arrived from Naples in 1892, and by 1912, he was one of the wealthiest and most politically connected Italians in the city. Along with being one of the biggest loan sharks in the area, Gallucci also ran the Royal Italian Lottery, which was actually a front for his own numbers racket, from which he made millions. Not afraid to flaunt his wealth, Gallucci was a dandy, walking around in expensive clothes, jeweled cufflinks, and large diamond pinky rings. He also had a favorite accessory that he carried on his person religiously. This accessory happened to be a lead-loaded, diamond-encrusted walking stick. From time to time, he was known to dispense beatings with it. Quite a few Italians in Little Italy owed their livelihood to Gallucci, and many others across the city owed him allegiance in some other way. Over time, he used this dependence to mobilize Italians to vote. Italian Americans were now one of the largest voting blocs in the city and could sway many potential elections, shifting the balance of power in Albany, New York City, and Washington. This would also foreshadow the control the Mafia would have over politics in years to come. The Lamonte brothers, while still technically in charge of the Morello family, feared the growing power of their capo down on 116th Street. They feared if certain measures were not taken, they could lose all they have. Fortunato and Tommaso Lamonte sat and discussed this matter one evening after the second member of the Baker gang went missing.
"You're sure Terranova was behind it?" Fortunato asked his brother. "It has to be. Two missing so quickly after the boy's funeral. It must be Nick Terranova," Tommaso replied plainly. "He's acting without our approval. Something needs to be done about this young upstart," Fortunato said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat.
However, what both of the Lamonte brothers left unsaid was that their rivals were all vicious killers. They correctly feared that they would need more powerful allies to take on the Terranovas and their crew. It was with that in mind that they set a meeting with the King of Little Italy.